In this brief talk on my book, The Unforgettable Queens of Islam, I first talk a little bit about women and political authority as reflected in the Quran and the Hadith. And by Hadith, I mean the sayings and deeds attributed to the Prophet of Islam, Prophet Muhammad, which collectively is understood to make the tradition. Then I say a few words about father-daughter relationship, and I end my presentations and look forward to your questions. For well over a decade, I have been fascinated by the unprecedented and paradoxical emergence of large numbers of Muslim women as political agents. From their impressive mobilizations and participations in the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the presidential election of 2009, to their vocal presence in North Africa and the Arab Spring, to the voice of concerned women, concerned mothers in Indonesia, women are joining their voices and energetically mobilizing their resources to participate in the political domain in an ever-increasing numbers. Educated and well-informed, women have shed the age-old cloak of cultural inhibitions and have challenged the rigid patriarchal construction of gender injustice, political and legal inequalities, gender hierarchy. They come from all walks of life and backgrounds, beliefs, classes, and stratas, religious or secular. And they are determined to have a seat at the political table, one that has long been so adamantly monopolized by men. Not wishing to feed the tired, universalized colonial narrative of victimized passive Muslim women, nor willing to suffer the intolerant essentialists and Islamists in their own home countries, women activists and scholars of Islam of all backgrounds have shown considerable awareness of and reflexivity to local and global political dynamics. They have questioned the male dominations of political authority and monopoly of sacred knowledge and have challenged patriarchal institutions on both fronts. Unwilling to subordinate their piety and devotion to misogynist orthodoxies, women scholars of Islam have contributed to our religious knowledge and developed feminist theologies based on a modernist and interpretive readings of the Quran, one that is more pluralistic, tolerant, egalitarian, and inclusive. Women's political authority, however, has received less systematic attention. It is highly contested and fraught with tensions and contradictions, and has faced a much tougher patriarchal challenge from within Muslim countries. But the rough political terrains have not stopped women from mobilizing and organizing in the Muslim world and beyond. The written history of Islam and the Muslim world, in all its geographical breadth and layers of complexities and diversity, is an overwhelmingly masculine history, one that has by and large ignored women and their sociocultural, creative, and political contributions, at least well until the 20th century. Yet this patriarchal history has not proceeded without challenges by women, sporadic and exceptional though women's participations in the political games of throne has been. What I have tried to do in my book is to gender the history of sovereignty and political authority in the Muslim world by highlighting the life stories of 5 Muslim women leaders who have contested the rules of dynastic and political power to become sovereigns in their own highly patriarchal societies. And the question is, well, how did they do it? How did they pull off such feat? What sociopolitical structures, cultural mechanisms, and personal dynamics, personal qualities enabled them to realize their objectives? Did they contravene religious and moral orders? Did riots break out in the cities large and small, in the streets of cities large and small? In talking about women and political authority, I am of course mindful that women have always wielded power in the sense of influencing other people's behavior, but often from behind the scenes, behind the throne, shall we say. Women have throughout history lived with men of power and have influenced them and exerted power over them. Indeed, there are more examples of women swaying the course of a society's history through their sons, husbands, and fathers than women who have actually worn the crown, as it were. But my interest in this book was with women at the forefront of political scene, women who have engaged the existing structures of powers and authority and have overcome religious objections and political obstacles to their leadership, be it in medieval Yemen and India or in modern Bangladesh and Indonesia. As I contemplated on the life stories of Muslim women political rulers from medieval to modern Islam, modern times, I recall an often repeated hadith on the subject allegedly attributed to the Prophet of Islam. And here is the hadith. Never will succeed such nation as makes a woman their rulers. End of quote. Where did this hadith come from and why? The military involvement of Aisha, one of the mothers of the believers and the beloved of Prophet Muhammad, in the Battle of Camel in 656, in which she led an opposition to the reigning caliph, who happened to be Caliph Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law and also his cousin, is allegedly occasioned the pronouncement of this hadith. It was not, however, until almost 200 years later that this hadith was authenticated and recorded by the famed scholar and hadith collector Imam Bukhari, who died in 870. Despite the fact that this was a singleton and a weak hadith, meaning that it was not corroborated by the companions and other companions and associates of Prophet Muhammad. Whether this is a forged hadith, as argued by Brown, or that the Prophet of Islam actually said that, has been debated in modern times by scholars such as Fatima Mernissi, Abu al-Fat, Father Ibrahim, and the debate continues in the web up to the present time. But this was not my focus in my book. Yet I also recall the Prophet of Islam has received divine revelations regarding the Queen of Shiva and her astute political leadership. The Quranic Queen of Shiva is the sovereign of an idyllic and peaceful community to which God has denied neither bounty nor riches. Above all, God has given the Queen a mighty throne, Arsh Azim, representing the seat of her power and authority. And this is taken from the Quran. The story of the Queen of Shiva is in the Quran, part of Surah 27, which is known as Adnab. And this particular ayah that I just recited to you is ayah 23. In my book, I argue that it is not the Queen's sovereignty that is the issue in the Quran. Her faith is. I contend that the divine revelations have more to do with the Queen's subjective transformations from ignorance of Islam, Jahiliyyah, to enlightenment than with sexual politics and submissions as imagined by Muslim medieval biographers. How are we to interpret the differences between the Quran and the Hadith, the revelations and the traditions, between these two supreme sources of authority regarding women and political authority in Islam, one supportive and the other opposed? Juxtaposing the Quranic support for women's sovereignty or absence of opposition to it with that of its prohibitions in the prophetic Hadith, I revisited the story of the Queen of Shiva of the Quranic revelations and examined the socio-political circumstances in the aftermath of Aisha's involvement in the Battle of Camel that occasioned the recollections of the prophetic Hadith. That was in order to contextualize the women's chances of or impediments to political leadership. So, the fascinating story of the Queen of Sheba and the leadership of Aisha, one of the most prominent women of Islam, formed the first two chapters in my book that frame the stories that follow. It is in the section of these two supreme sources of authority and the socio-political dynamics on the ground that I locate the prospect for and challenges to women's path to political leadership and Muslim exegetes and leaders' opposition to or ambivalence regarding women and political authority. Now, my interest was first in the women and political authority was initially invoked by the election of Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan in 1988. She was the first democratically elected prime minister in a Muslim country and perhaps the youngest of the leaders in all over the world at the time. So it was very exciting for me at the time. But her electoral victory was particularly remarkable in the face of the fact that a lawsuit was brought against her by Jamaat-e-Islami, Pakistan's foremost political and religious party. The suit challenged her right to the political leadership based on the alleged prophetic hadith that I just told you that. The suit was backed by a powerful faction of the political elite, but fortunately, Lahore High Court dismissed the case, at least at that time. The debate regarding Muslim women's political authority and leadership, however, has continued, and not just in Pakistan. It also flared up in Indonesia in the late 1990s. The same hadith was used to prevent Megawati Sukarnoputri from becoming the first female president in 1999 of a Muslim state. Again, factions of political elite joined forces with the religious elite to prevent Megawati from becoming the president, even though her party had won the highest number of votes. But she eventually did come to power constitutionally, and that was after President Abdul Rahman Wahid had self-destructed. Now, Megawati and Benazir also form different chapters in my book. Then, at the threshold of the 21st century, an extraordinary news came from Iran, of all these places, that 47 women had nominated themselves for president in the Islamic Republic of Iran. One of them was a highly educated, tightly veiled, and articulate woman who told me that she saw no incompatibility between being a woman and becoming a president of a country such as the Islamic Republic of Iran. She was one of the 6 women presidential contenders whom I interviewed for my video documentary that I was just mentioned, Women and Mrs. President, Women and Political Leadership in Iran, which is being distributed now. This lady, this woman, underscored the legitimacy, indeed the necessity, of her run for presidency in Iran. First and foremost, on the basis of the Quranic revelations regarding the sovereignty of Queen of Shiva. She said, and I quote, "We have," that is in the Quran, "a country where a woman called the Queen of Shiva was ruling. This is very important for us." She kept repeating that this is very important for us. And she continued, "Historically, women have played fundamental role, naqsh asli, in the lives of male religious and political leaders." She stressed the role mothers and wives played in the lives of Abrahamic prophets, including Muhammad, Jesus, and Moses. She further emphasized the indispensable financial assistance and emotional support Khadija, Prophet Muhammad's first wife, and another mothers of the believers provided for Prophet of Islam. Knowledgeable about the tenor of the religious and political discourse of the Islamic Republic of Iran, she supported her run for the presidency by systematically quoting Quranic verses or prophetic hadith. And she used similar religious political logic to counter the patriarchal elite's justifications for restricting women's access to political domain. Now here we have two different approaches to the issue of women and political authority. One is pursued by the male religious and political elite, opposing women's political leadership based on the prophetic hadith, and the other advocated by some women, such as the woman I just mentioned to you, based on the Quranic revelation, which, according to Muslims, is the highest source of authority and legitimacy in the Muslim world. Now, how and under what circumstances was this hadith invoked or ignored? Counterintuitive though it may sound, it is in fact in modern times that institutional religious objections have been raised to women's political authority by invoking the alleged prophetic hadith. The 11th century Queen Arwa, Yemenite Queen Arwa, and the 13th century Razia Sultan of India, each of whom has a chapter in my book, both rose to power through the solid support of their fathers or husband, though neither queen was wanting in political ambition and charisma, and neither queen faced organized oppositions from the religious elite or from the public. Both of them were quite popular. Queen Arwa's long reign, she was in power from 1067 to 1138, that coincided with three successive Fatimid Imam caliphs in Cairo, none of whom is recorded to have raised any objections to the queen's authority. In fact, the all-powerful Imam Caliph al-Mustansir, who died in 1094 and was perceived as infallible by his followers, not only he did not object to the queen's leadership, in fact, he helped to consolidate her political authority by elevating her to the status of Hujjah. And Hujjah is the highest religious authority immediately after Imam Caliph himself. As the highest temporal and religious authority, Imam Caliph al-Mustansir preempted potential religious discontent by stating his full confidence in the wisdom of the queen, that is to say, the wisdom of her esoteric religious knowledge. Likewise, Da'i al-Khattab, one of the leading religious figures at the time, floated the mystical idea of body envelope to legitimize the queen's spiritual authority. Al-Khattab's reasoning was that when a woman has reached such high level of religious knowledge and wisdom, she's no longer a woman. She's no longer a woman. She's a man, even if her body envelope was female. And here I'm referencing Tarabulsi. The point here is that not only did Imam Caliph and the Da'i not oppose the queen's religious authority, they did in fact their utmost to justify her religious elevation. Regardless of whether there was any religious hand-wringing and political opposition then or later, and in fact there were more later, Queen Arwa continued to rule effectively for 71 years and to provide peace and prosperity for her people, who affectionately called her our mistress. In 13th century India, under the Delhi Sultanate, likewise, we hear of no institutional religious opposition to Razia Sultan, who rose to power and occupied the throne and ruled from 1236 to 1240. Most conspicuous is the silence of the court historian and biographer, Minhajuddin Siraj Jozjani, who died in 1193, who also happened to be a judge and a religious leader. He registered no opposition, personal or institutional, to Razia Sultan's ascension to power in 1236. His silence may be explained by the fact that he was in the service of the queen. The queen had hired him. In fact, her father had, and he continued working for the queen. The religious establishment, likewise, must have felt beholden to the queen, who, as the commander-in-chief, successfully defeated religious minorities' rebellions, rescuing the former from the latter's sustained harassments. Razia Sultan was eventually toppled. but not by religious oppositions or popular uprising, but by a racially motivated political military elite who felt threatened by her independent spirit and solid public support, and accused her of immodesty in appearance. Presumably, she didn't wear her veil or wore something that resembled closely that of men's clothing, and immorality in her relationship with her Ethiopian slave Amir advisor, whom she had inherited from her father, who was very devoted to her. Now, the question is, why was this hadith not invoked in medieval times, but appealed to in modern times in the cases of Benazir Bhutto and Megawati Sukarnoputri that I just told you? Well, we may entertain at least two reasons for that. First is the issue of dynastic succession and the role of political military elite in supporting or opposing a ruler. So long as the dynastic rivalries were restricted to the ruling dynasty, the people, including the religious leaders, were neither in a position to object nor particularly interested to intervene. Although women's political leadership was a rarity, when it did occur, it depended primarily on the pragmatics of political authority on the ground. That is to say, on the moral authority and support of an influential dynastic patriarch, and the dynamics of his patronage of the religious cleric and institutions. Thus, in the face of the father's support for his daughters or a wife, less frequently, little or no organized and institutional religious objections were raised in medieval Yemen or India. Modern times brought about significant shifts in women's knowledge and sensibilities regarding legal equality, gender justice, visibility, and political participation and leadership. Muslim women's political global mobilization and their demand for making their voices heard and for political representations threatens the foundations of male sacral authority and their patriarchal political domination and privileges. Hence, the greater political religious push for the applications of the prophetic hadith to delegitimize women's demand for political representation. This is the second reason that I would like to bring to your attention. That is to say, in the absence of women's mass movement and organized political agitations in medieval times, women rulers did not seem to pose any long-term political threat to the male elite, and the religious elite had little reason to invoke the hadith. Whether in modern or medieval times, however, politics and religion are mutually constitutive. But in medieval Yemen and India, politics trumped religion. It was the commanding power of an autocratic sultan or caliph in favor of his daughter that silenced possible organized religious opposition to her. Both Benazir Bhutto and Megawati Sukarnoputri faced opposition from religious leaders who raised the banner of Islam is in danger in their bid to become prime minister and president of their respective countries. The fact that organized opposition from the likes of Jamaat-e-Islami was ultimately ineffectual, perhaps momentarily, in barring Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan and Megawati Sukarnoputri in Indonesia, is not only indicative of the enduring power of the dynastic ties, but also of the existence of constitution, rule of law, power of popular vote, and public support in these countries. Now, let me say a few words about father-daughter relationship here. In patrilineal, feudal, and tribal societies, male children are strongly desired and descent is traced through the male line, and power, prestige, and privilege automatically pass on to male descendants. Yet, The father-son axis is potentially and sometimes actually a nexus of tension and rivalry between the two men who in fact may fear, resent, or seek to eliminate each other. History provides ample examples of fatal rivalries between imperial fathers and covetous sons who are in a structural position to dislodge the patriarch. But where do women fit into this contentious patriarchal dynastic scheme? Whether on the throne or more often behind it, women have shown their ambition and determination to become involved in political games of intrigues. Unlike their brothers, however, many royal princesses' relations with their fathers seem to be based on a more solid emotional foundation and mutual affection. The emotional bonds between a ruler patriarch and his daughter may not only be psychologically satisfying and unthreatening to the father, but also politically advantageous to the daughter. The patriarch supports, bestows power and prestige on the daughter, facilitates her presence in the public domain, and silences her detractors, at least for a while, and legitimizes her political authority and activities, thus expediting her ascent to the apex of political hierarchy. Succession, as I have argued in my book, works through dynastic ties, whether orderly or contentious. And women are just as structurally situated to benefit from this connection as men, though usually not as frequently. But when a son fails, a charismatic daughter or sister may gain the attention of the patriarch and quickly rise to power. In modern times, women leaders have had to win an election, but the dynastic ties always have. Although hailing from different cultural traditions and historical periods, all the women in my book possess a distinguished genealogical pedigree and enjoyed the support of their powerful fathers and less frequently of their husbands. These cross-gender filial relationships I have argued in my book of Pakistan very briefly. That is one of the prevailing paradoxes of patriarchy or a patriarchal authority. In the course of writing this book, I came to think that the dynastic patriarchal support for his daughter's leadership may not be so much paradoxical as it is practical, even logical, indicative of the fluidity of patriarchy and its pragmatic malleability. Now we can ask a question here: is women's political authority different from that of men's? Does it make any difference in the lives of their followers? To begin with, my sample of Muslim queens is too small to make cross-gender comparisons meaningful. Nonetheless, a few general observations are in order. Women rulers, like their male counterparts, are first and foremost ambitious politicians interested in the preservation of the authority and expansions of the power base. Though their hold on power is more tenuous, often it is a lot more tenuous. Like their male counterpart, they occupy a contested position and their policies and activities are scrutinized from many vantage points. Seldom, if ever, have sovereign leaders had universal support or unanimous approval ratings, be they male or female, in medieval or in modern times. Women leaders, on the other hand, appear less threatening than male rulers, who may have a propensity to exhibit harsher autocratic tendencies. Tolerant of diversity and ethnicity, by and large, women rulers that I mentioned in my book tended to be more inclusive and generally more caring. In fact, caring is the quintessential characteristics of the Queen of Sheba, who adamantly refused to take his people to war with Solomon and therefore ruined her land, her people, and her community. Women connected more easily with people, often presenting themselves as members of the larger community, family members. All the women rulers mentioned in this book had to face disgruntled military personnel, which is one of the most fiercely masculine and conservative institutions of patriarchy. They find it difficult to obey or yield to a female-led civilian government. Feeling threatened by the possibility of greater democratization and the loosening of the total control of patriarchal institutions, the political, military, and religious elite close ranks to intimidate, dominate, and limit women's opportunities to participate in political games of succession, be it dynastic or electoral. Aware of the dangerous games of successions they have engaged in, modern women leaders follow a pattern of governance that is more democratic, more inclusive, and less violent. And I'm referencing various peoples here. They pay greater attention to women's issues and do not suffer bouts of male chauvinism. And to quote Martin Luther King, they may in time usher a revolution of values. By bringing together life stories of Muslim women rulers from medieval to modern times and situating their ascent to power within their society's kinship, religious, legal, and socio-political context, I have aimed to highlight on-the-ground patterns of gender politics, alliances and rivalries, tensions and dynamics between different sources of authority, from sacred to profane. Religion, as it becomes clear in my book, is not necessarily the main obstacle to Muslim women's political authority, contrary to the dominant assumptions, be it Orientalist or Islamist. It is rather the entrenched political power structure and patriarchal dominations that in modern times has sought ever closer cooperations with the increasingly ideologically motivated religious leaders and institutions. Their appeal to the prophetic hadith against women's political leadership has historically depended on the presence or absence of women's mass movements, which poses a threat to male political elites' monopoly of power and authority. It is not only women's attempts to develop a feminist theology that concerns the religious leaders. It is also, but even more so, the power of women's demand for gender equality and the collective power of the political mobilization that poses a real threat to the traditional male domination and privileges. The trajectory of lives, triumphs, travails, and governance of these unforgettable queens of Islam vary greatly, given the historical distance between them, as well as their individuality, authority, and charisma, and the nature of the relationship to their followers and their fathers, and the particularities of the societies in which they lived. The brief ethnohistory of their lives and legacy highlights the indelible marks they have left on the societies and on the history of Muslim cultures. The biographies and those of powerful women behind the throne also lay bare the politically motivated religious narrative of doom foretold should women gain political authority. As for the Queen of Shiva, God gave her a mighty throne, the seat of her authority, and medieval Muslim sources and local imaginations endowed the legendary queen with a powerful father whose mantle of political authority and leadership she assumed after his death. May God continue to empower women with mighty thrones. And here I end my brief presentation and look forward to your questions. I'm going to read this question, so please correct me if I'm wrong. The question is, barring Aisha, the rest of the women came from outside the heartland of Islam. Is that what enabled them to rise to power? Well, I mentioned, yes. I mean, I just want to say that how Aisha was used as a model, and strategically and opportunistically was used to prevent women or discourage women from political visibility and political voice. So yes, many other women, and these women whose, a few women whose life stories I told you, came from various locations in the Muslim world, and their charisma, their political ambition depends on the kinds of society they lived in, relationship they had with their fathers, particular cultural customs and traditions they had. All of that very important in the sense of enabling these women to come to power. I'm going to see if there are any other questions. Okay, now there is another one. Thank you. The question is, I'm wondering if you could please comment on the significance of father-daughter relationship in present time. Oh, this is very interesting. It has interested me throughout. Of course, part of the father-daughter relationship goes back to my own relationship to my father, who was very supportive of me when I was doing my initial research in Rome, in Iran, in just before and after the revolution of 1979. But look, the father-daughter relationship is tremendously important. If you look at, I gave two examples of modern world. That of Megawati Sukarnoputri, who had a great relationship with her father, and Benazir Bhutto, also great relationship with her father. But let's look around us here. Of course, we do not want to, I don't want to minimize the effort women themselves put into achieving their goals. But just let's look at the presidential contest in this country right now. A few days ago, when President Trump made his comments in, I suppose it was in New Hampshire, he touted the significance of a presidency of his daughter. And rest assured that this is going to be very, very important in terms if and when she may decide to run for presidency. So that dynastic ties, that relationship has already given her a huge platform to make herself known to the public, to benefit from all kinds of network of alliances. So she's, in that sense, Ivanka, in that sense, is far ahead of the rest of the women who may want to run for the presidency. That's not to say that the other women do not have the ambitions or the capacities or the qualifications that are needed to run for presidency. But what I'm saying is that this relationship is very, very important in laying the ground for a woman who may want to come to such high position of power. I don't see other questions. Hold on. Okay. There's another, and this other question is very interesting. Someone is asking, have you done any research on Pari Khan Khanum? Of course, she is one of the most interesting women princesses working behind the scene and being very, very powerful. For those of you who may not know the story of Pari Khan Khanum was an Iranian princess, one of the daughters of Shah Tahmasp II, and sister of Ismail II. Her father was very fond of her, and she was very involved in political dynamics of the palace. And when the father died, he had several sons from several wives. And this is one of the interesting cases that I also talk in my book, the problem of polygynous courts, polygynous palaces, where there are so many women and each one of whom may have a son, and all of whom have a legitimate claim to carry the mantle of the father. But anyways, to get back to Pari Khan Khanum, when the father died, she quickly took control of the activities of the court to administer what was going on. One of her brothers, Ismail II, was already exiled by the father, by Tahmasp, who was in fact fearful of what the son may do to him. That's why he had sent him to exile many, many miles outside of their country. Pari was interested in him taking power to the point that when another of his brothers, half brothers, claimed the mantle of the father, she quickly turned against him, and with other people, that brother was eliminated. So here Ismail is coming to Iran, and Perry assumes that because he has been out of the courts, out of the country, and out of the court's policies for so long, then he will be dependent on her. But of course, by the time he gets there, he feels so threatened by her that he bans her, he banishes her from the palace. And not only that, he goes on this rampage, killing of all his brothers, nephews, anybody who could have a legitimate claim to the throne. And the only one he doesn't kill is his own full brother, who happened to be legally blind, and he exiles him all the way down to Shiraz, south of the country. So, but he was not a very well-liked, understandably, king, and he was always in the companion of his male friend. And in a year and a half after his leadership, then he's found dead of poison or opium. He was addicted. Now it's not clear whether he was poisoned or he actually was killed by overdose. Many people suspect Pari Khan Khanum to be involved in that. In fact, I was in Iran and went to Qazvin several years ago, and I went to the palace to visit that, and I talked to the director of the palace, who adamantly believed that Pari Khan Khanum, in fact, was responsible for her brother's death. Never mind. But anyways, she tries to have her brother, who was legally blind, to help him to come to power. Now, this time being certain that because he was legally blind, he would be dependent on her to run the affairs of the state. Well, her brother had a very powerful wife too, and she did not want to have any competitions. So before Pari knew it, the sister-in-law, Muhammad Khudabanda's wife, arranged for Pari to be killed, assassinated. She was killed just a few days before her 30th birthday. So she's a very, very interesting character, and I have a few pages in my book about her. So let's see. There is another question. Regarding the Queen of Sheba in medieval imagination, I wonder how she was perceived and written among medieval people in areas where queens like Razia Sultan reigned, as opposed to where fewer women were active in politics. This is, again, a very interesting question, and trying to draw parallels between the Queen of Sheba and Razia Sultan. Razia Sultan became very, very powerful, and well-known and popular in her own country then and now. In fact, as many of you may know, Indian TV has been having this melodrama about her life, many episodes, 170, 180 episodes, and they're quite interesting. Interestingly, Razia herself, accordingly, had a coin minted in her name. For, as many of you may know, two of the most important signs of sovereignty was to have khutbah ceremony read in a sovereign's name, and also coins minted in their name. So there were coins minted in her name, and in one of them is apparently said something to the effect of Queen of the World, Bilghis Jahan, and that's the title of my chapter. So she made the connection, but whether or not people made the connection, I don't have any information on that. I don't have any knowledge, but that's a very, very fascinating, very interesting question. But it's interesting to know that both Razia Sultan and Queen Arwa, either themselves or people at the time, were aware of these connections. Razia Sultan was known as the Queen of the World, Bilghis Jahan, because Bilghis is the popular name used for the Queen of Sheba. And in Yemen, Queen Arwa was still is known as the Little Queen of Sheba. In fact, she is so well known in Yemen. I mean, whatever that is left on Yemen, unfortunately, that fascinating, magnificent land and civilizations and people have been really almost demolished. But there were still streets named after the Queen Erwa, and the mosques that she built, the palace and mosque that she built, were pilgrimage centers where people until recently used to go there and pay tribute to her. So it's really interesting to see how those two queens made references, the medieval queens made references to the Queen of Shiva, whereas neither Benazir Bhutto nor Megawati Sukarnoputri made any reference, any mention of the Queen of Shiva. But that's a fascinating story, and it is so popular all over the world. There are versions, the Jewish version, Christian version, Ethiopian version. It's just a fascinating transcultural, transnational story. The question is, what can young women learn from this history? How can they deploy it as they contemplate the role of women in politics? Well, I think these are fascinating stories. Throughout history, people need models, role models, examples. And just by looking at Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan or Megawati in Indonesia, you'd be surprised to hear how many women have been inspired by them. And these, of course, work themselves historically. It's not something that can happen quickly and in no time. It takes time, but the more people know about these characters, and that's another thing I wanted to do. I realized that not very many people knew about these queens. Of course, some people know about Benazir Bhutto, but I was surprised in my classes, even educated students had never heard of Benazir Bhutto, let alone of Queen Erwa or Queen Razia Sultan. And that's even Muslim students themselves. I have many Muslim students in my classes, and sometimes they are just unaware of that. And when I teach about these courses, I'm always interested in finding out what these young women think, and they always let me know, how fascinated they are, how they think, well, why have they not heard about this character? Why are the images of women they see in their own books and back home in their own countries or in this country are so often negative of women, particularly Muslim women's political agency, which I found is quite interesting and in fact quite different from what it is in this country. Women have always had ambition, political ambitions, and tried to use their political agency. It's just that when they got just a little bit of opening, then they quickly try to exert themselves and become active and visible and powerful. So I'm hoping that these women will become good role models, and gradually they become more and more powerful. One thing that just surprised me when I was doing this book was that how little in the Muslim world, and of course others too, but Muslim world was my interest, knew little about the Queen of Sheba. Even if they knew anything about her, they were mostly negative. She was often portrayed as a sex object, as a femme fatale, as someone who tried to seduce Solomon, rather than saying what a great leader she was, how wise she was. She sought consultation. She talked to her advisors, and she decided against going to war with Suleiman. She sent him gifts in the hopes of creating a transactions, sort of by sending gift, trying to encourage him to agree to peaceful negotiations rather than violent and relationship and violent attack. So I think it is important to really know more about our own stories, and the stories are very, very important in terms of connecting with our ideas and feelings and thoughts and reactions. So I'm hoping that these women will create a good role model for the young women in this country or in their own home countries, in Muslim countries, I mean. So someone says, excuse me, also Bibi meaning Benazir Bhutto, Munajjam Neshaburi and her power uh, on Shah. Do you have any information about her? Just for my information. Bibi Munajjam. Oh, this is Bibi. I see. I thought Bibi was Benazir Bhutto. Bibi Munajjam of Neshabur. She's quite fun. All I know about her is that she was, I think, during the Safavid, that is to say, in the 16th and 17th century, and she was actually she was not only a Munajjama, that is a scientist, but also a poet, if I remember my information about her correctly. Beyond that, I don't know much about it, but I think maybe the Sousa, this scholar, has written about her, but I don't know much about her. I'm sorry. Okay, let me see. There is another question. Were there immediate authorities and advisors and political allies include any women in any case? Oh, that's another interesting story. In fact, one of the things that I talk about, particularly in medieval cases, Queen Arwa, as exciting as she was, she has her mother-in-law, who happened to be also her aunt, was a very powerful woman, also herself a power behind the throne. So she had her as a mentor, but we see nowhere in her background, I mean, among her advisors, any women advisors, not even her own daughter. She had some very good male advisor, but no female advisor. Likewise, for Razia, not her mother. Her stepmother was, bent on killing her. But so we don't hear of any female advisor in neither of the queens. But when we come to the modern times, I know more about Benazir Bhutto, who had several very interesting, very competent, very qualified female um, advisors. And also what I hear about Benazir Bhutto, that she felt very comfortable to be with people. So she would be walking among people. In fact, as Asma Jahangir told me, that she was more comfortable to be with ordinary people, to go to stay with, in communities of women, I mean, of ordinary people, rather than among the aristocracy or the feudal families in Pakistan. So they do have women political allies and friends and advisors, but more so we know about them because there's very little information about the medieval queens, but more so about the modern contemporary queens. And yes, both these women leaders had advisors, female advisors, and hopefully they mentored them. Again, Megawati has her own daughters, of course, who is now becoming very prominent in politics. Benazir Bhutto's daughters as well, but she had a lot more other women involved in her immediate circle of advisors and planners. If there is any question, that should be the last one, because I realize that the time is going by quickly. Okay, there is another question here. I'm going to read that. In rural Pakistan, people, in parentheses men, spoke in favor of the candidacy of Benazir Bhutto by referring to the comparison between Aisha's relationship to the Prophet and Benazir's relationship to her father. Do you know if that was initiated by PPP or perhaps by local leaders? I don't know this is a very, again, good question. I don't know the origin of the questions, but yes, you're right. She was very popular among people, and people know, these our knowledge about our religious figures whom we use as role models is a public knowledge. Everybody knows about Hazrat Aisha, Bibi Aisha, as she's known in Pakistan. And to compare her to Benazir Bhutto is not far-fetched. In fact, in my book, I have written when she, for the third time, went back to Pakistan. If you pay attention to the way she was dressed, her shalwar kameez, the green color of Islam, and the white shalwar, and her dupatta and all that, reminded one, at least it reminded me, of the early prominent women of early Islam. So who initiated such comparisons, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if it just was autochthonous and, organically developed among people. And many people saw in her the charisma she had, the courage that she had, the genuine feeling that she had for Pakistan. She absolutely loved Pakistan and Pakistan. She knew what may happen to her if she goes back to Pakistan for the third time. In other words, she seemed to have already foretold, understood her own death. Nonetheless, she wanted to be reunited with her people and possibly win another election and change the course of her country's political life.